Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Lead Center webinar for July 30th. This webinar is on customized employment, moving beyond the basics. And my name is Brittany Taylor. I am the lead coordinator for the National Disability Institute, and I will be facilitating this discussion today. We have a tremendous speaker joining us who is actually on the ground right now providing trainings in Wyoming. Bob Nemec is a senior consultant with Griffin Hammis Associates. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and expertise on this topic. For those of you that are new to the Lead Center webinars, the National Center on Leadership for the Employment and Economic Advancement of People with Disabilities, or as we call it, the Lead Center, is a collaborative of disability workforce and economic empowerment organizations led by National Disability Institute with funding from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office on Disability Employment Policy. And speaking of the U.S. Department of Labor Office of Disability Employment Policy, I'd like to hand our mic over to our colleague at ODEP, Speed Davis, for his welcome.
Thank you, Brittany. On behalf of the ODEP Assistant Secretary, Kathy Martinez, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I see a growing audience here. This is the fifth in our series of customized employment webinars, and there undoubtedly will be more. We at ODEP think that customized is a valuable tool for creating employment opportunities for individuals that most of the systems had previously thought were unable to be employed. It gives VR and the IGT agencies a new tool that they can use to serve clients they previously had to turn away because they couldn't figure out what to do with them. We are developing a compendium on our website, a collection of the states that have adopted or are adopting customized employment, and along with supporting documentation. We have 3 agencies from 2 states currently on the page, which you can find by going to the ODEP website at odep.gov/dol.gov/ODEP, and then select customized employment in the window at the top. In some ways, customized is still growing. As evidence of that, we are currently testing a new way of delivering customized employment and discovery in the American Job Centers. So there'll be another resource available to people with disabilities. So with that, I'll turn it back to Brittany and let the show go on.
Great. Thank you so much, Speed. And before we go any further, I want to just offer a few housekeeping tips, and I am going to invite my colleague, Nakia Matthews, to share those with you at this time.
Afternoon, everyone. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio via the audio broadcast panel, which you see here. If you accidentally close this panel, or if the sound stops or becomes unintelligible, you can reopen it by going to the top menu, Communicate, Join Audio Broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer, or you prefer to listen by phone, you can dial the number that you see here, and you do not need to enter an attendee ID. And I will also paste this information into the chat box. Real-time captioning is provided during this webinar. The captions can be found in the Media Viewer panel, which appears in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar platform. If you'd like to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can do so by minimizing some of the other panels, like chat or Q&A, and conversely, if you do not need the captions, you can close or minimize the Media Viewer panel. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat box or the Q&A box to send any questions you may have during the course of the webinar to either myself, Nakia Matthews, or Brittany Taylor, and we will direct those questions to our speaker during the Q&A portion. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the web portion, you may also ask questions by emailing Brittany directly at btaylor@ndi-inc.org. Please note this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the Lead Center website at the URL you see below. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send me a message, Nakia Matthews, or you may also email me directly at nmatthews@ndi-inc.org.
Thank you, Nakia. So getting started today, I just want to review the Lead Center mission, and it's to advance sustainable individual and systems level change that results in improved, competitive, integrated employment and economic self-sufficiency outcomes for individuals across the spectrum of disability. As Steve described, we do this through webinars, training, and technical assistance and several other Lead Center initiatives. And before I hand this off to Bob, I just want to take a moment to frame today's conversation. The Lead Center is collaborating with a very unique group of nationally recognized subject matter experts in the areas of customized employment, self-employment, and blended and braiding resources. And we're leveraging the knowledge of these experts to provide intensive technical assistance and training to staff across American job centers and their partners on customized employment and group discovery. And we're creating additional opportunities for people with disabilities to secure and maintain employment. And today's webinar is really building on some previous webinars that we've done here at the Lead Center on group discovery and customized employment. And if you did not get a chance to see these yet, we do have them archived on our website at www.leadcenter.org. You can get the previous webinars in accessible format. There's a version of it on YouTube, and then all the related handouts are available in their entirety. Today's discussion will go a little bit deeper, though, into one approach on customized employment and give you a little bit better understanding of the technique that Griffin Hammes uses in achieving customized employment. So just to review the agenda, today's agenda will focus on achieving the following. We'll review the learning objectives in a moment, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bob Nemec from Griffin Hammes. He's going to provide a brief overview of customized employment, the discovery as the foundation of customized employment, linking discovery to employment, employment supports, ongoing career development, and then share a customized employment success story. Following that, we will have a question and answer period. If there are questions that you have about some of his remarks throughout the presentation, please know that you can enter your questions into the chat box at any time. We'll compile them here on our end, and then at the end we'll take questions. And then before I hand it over to Bob, I just wanted to also review a few of the webinar outcomes that we are hoping that we will all achieve today. We're hoping that you'll understand the 4 phases of customized employment, how to use that information gleaned in discovery to guide job development and employment supports, how to discover the abundance of business in the community, and then as I mentioned, we'll also hear a success story on customized employment. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Bob. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you. Wow, well, this is great, and it's funny to watch on the little window on the side here as the number of attendees grows. So that's pretty amazing up there. We have almost 400 people participating in this. So I'm really pleased to do this webinar for the Lead Center and for ODEP. And as Brittany said, I'm currently in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I spent the morning and yesterday afternoon with an organization here and with some job seekers doing parts of discovery with people. So it's a pretty good time that we had, and I may be able to talk a little bit about that as we go through this. I've been doing employment for people with disabilities for a really long time, like over 30 years, and I've gone through every one of the things that we have done in employment for people, from sheltered work to placement to supported employment to now customized employment. And as customized employment excuse me, continues to evolve, you know, being part of it is pretty exciting. What I'm going to share with you is kind of my personal take on how we have approached customized employment at Griffin Hammes Associates, and why I'm so excited to be part of Griffin Hammes Associates, because we're doing, I think we're learning new things all the time. It's really a pretty amazing process. But what I will tell you is that in my career, in my experience with employment and people with disabilities, this is the best approach that I have seen to date. I don't think it's the last approach. I think as more people become competent and skilled in customized employment strategies, it's only going to improve. And so, so this is a stopping point right now for me, and I think for most of us. So, but I think it's important to talk about it. Regardless of the type of employment that you are, approach that you're going to take to doing employment with people with disabilities, you're pretty much going to have to involve 4 things. And those 4 things have typically been, assessment or evaluation, and then job development, and then on-the-job supports, ordinarily job coaching, and then ongoing support. And those 4 things always have had to happen. So what you have here in this slide is a representation of what those 4 things look like in customized employment, and in particular, the Griffin Ham's our approach to customized employment, which I really want to point out isn't the only approach. There are plenty of other ways to do this. I particularly like this one. I think it works very well, and so that's what we're going to share with you. But the first phase of any type of employment is some form of assessment. Customized employment talks about that assessment piece, or that initial getting to know folks as discovery. And our take on discovery is something we call discovering personal genius. Based on all of the work that's been done to date, from career planning to person-centered planning to personal futures planning to vocational profiles, it takes in all of those things, and then we take it in a little different direction, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second phase, which is conventionally referred to as job development, I like to think of it as more or less cultivating employment opportunities. I think it's a misnomer when we think about human service organizations or social service organizations as job developers, because I'm not sure we do that. I think people in the business community are the job developers. So we're more or less prospectors and discoverers. The third stage then is once someone gets a job, how is that person supported on the job? And there are a lot of ways that happens. And regardless of the type of disability a person might have, or the involvement or severity or significance of it, there's still going to be some form of support that keeps that person going and helps them move along. And then the fourth phase is the ongoing phase. What's next? One of the things I think is really interesting in talking to people, when you think about folks who do not have disabilities, people who have started their careers at age 14, 15, their work life at 14 or 15 or 16, and how many people do you know, or how many people on this call have said this, and they're, I'll do this job until something better comes along. I'll do this job until I find something else, right? And that's kind of an ordinary, typical way that we all approach employment. I think it's unfortunate too often that people with disabilities don't get to do that they basically are expected to find a job or have help finding a job, and that's going to be it. I think Mark Gold, years and years ago, didn't necessarily refer to it in the form of community employment, but he called it the one and done. He tried it, it didn't work, so it never happens again. So ongoing support becomes really important, because what's next? What's the career stairway look like for a person? Now, why is this different in customized employment? And why do we describe it with this circle with arrows moving around? Is because in the customized employment world, these 4 elements are integrated and they rely on one another. In the conventional ways of doing supported employment and job placement, which I have done, there are the same 4 phases, but they're episodes. And so the first episode is the evaluation or assessment episode. And then when it's done, when it's finished, the next phase begins, which is the job development episode. And when that phase is over, the person gets a job. Now the employment supports or job coaching episode begins. And then as that episode continues, then the 4th episode, or ongoing support, may or may not happen. What I found and what I continue to see with organizations that I observe both in Minnesota where I live and all across the country is that these 4 elements in the conventional methods are not necessarily connected with one another. So that essentially what happens is an evaluation is performed, done, written, there it goes on to the next phase, and now job developers get that and find very little useful information in there, so they begin once again. And the reason they begin once again is because the question that isn't asked typically in the assessment evaluation piece is, who is this person? They would test people on things as opposed to knowing who the person is. So job developers start from scratch again, and then going out into the community, doing a lot of the ordinary things that people do, looking through the WAD ads, Craigslist, popping in, whatever it takes. And then when a person does eventually get a job, then the ongoing supports start to kick in. And if even the planning for the ongoing, for the employment supports starts to kick in, it's sort of like, now what? Now, I know there are organizations that do this better than other organizations, but if you look at our statistics and only 20% of people with disabilities participating in the workforce, it says maybe we need to do some other things. Well, what happens in the customized employment world that's so significant is that discovering personal genius or discovery will direct job development as opposed to being just an assessment piece that ends when whatever the last step of the assessment is. So because discovery is going to take you as an employment consultant to the places that make sense based on who that person is, it's a little bit more targeted and focused search, if you will. Then when you take it into the engaging employment supports, whether they be instruction or tools or transportation or all the things that may be part of that, those things are not nearly as complicated because discovery will have identified the things where the person needs supports. And because it identified the supports that a person needs, and there are always going to be things that are going to pop up that you won't anticipate, but the general ones you're going to get, they're going to be in place at the places where the person went to go get a job because that was learned during discovery. And then ongoing support and career development becomes really integral because the person's personal profile that is initially created during discovery continues to grow as people grow. And everything that's learned along the way in discovery, in the job search, in the employment piece adds to the ongoing personal profile of that person. I mean, I would hesitate to even think about what my personal profile might look like all these years later if that was happening with me, the growing thing. So anyway, so that's why this is exciting, because each piece is connected. And then let me just say that most effectively, when this is done most effectively, it's done by one person. I'm the person who has leading the discovery with the job seeker. I'm the person who's going to connect with the businesses based on what I've learned by the job seeker. I'm the person who's going to engage the employment supports, maybe provide some, I'm not sure. And I'm the person who's going to follow up on it. So there's not this handoff of a bunch of different people that, again, requires us to almost start from scratch. This is a more linear way of looking at that same diagram. So, and again, for some folks, they like to see it in order. But again, the key elements of discovering personal genius are vocational themes, interests and skills, and ideal conditions of employment. And how we connect with businesses is a little different than most people do. And again, we use informational interviews and paid work trials. Employment supports, a couple of them that are pretty common to talk about are systematic instruction and coworker training and support. And then again, there's the ongoing employment consultation. Phase one is discovering personal genius or discovery. And it answers the basic question, who are you? I mean, if you go to the ODEP website and you click on a customized employment and you then click on the videos of customized employment, in each one of those videos, in English and in Spanish, you'll hear Michael Callahan, Michael, one of the great thinkers and practitioners and founders of a lot of this stuff, talks about discovery and customized employment, and saying that if it's about the individual, then we better figure out who that person is. Discovery in our world identifies 3 vocational themes, and the idea about themes is I'll get into this a little bit later, are much bigger than job descriptions. And I'll give you an example today. You know, this one young guy, and he's like 19 years old, and he's into all kinds of things. And everybody says that he's into cleaning. But what we've learned is that he's not into cleaning. He's into machines that are used in cleaning. And then we started digging a little bit further into things. And we're going to be pursuing a theme that looks a little bit more like repair. That he really likes fixing stuff, and so we're going to start to follow that theme. That theme will generate a list of 20 places in the community where that makes sense. And I know sometimes people think about this as, how can I find 20 places in a small town or a small community? It can be done, and because we're not necessarily looking for specific jobs, we're looking for information that will lead us down the path to specific jobs. Informational interviews and paid work experiences are very helpful. Now, in the case of this young fellow here in Wyoming, he's being supported by an agency and has like 4,000 hours available for him to do job trial. It's amazing. I can't even imagine it. And so to be able to set up some informational meetings and some job trial, paid job trials and on-the-job training in a lot of different places for this young guy is a real benefit. I don't know how they pulled it off, but it's happened. And to think about it, here's this young guy, he's 19 years old, and if we think back to, if I think back to myself at 19, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I had already done a bunch of things before I'd gotten to be 19 as jobs as a kid, and had changed jobs a lot of different times. So for this young guy to have a lot of different work experiences that don't lock him into having to pick a career is really an important thing. And so to have these paid work trials and opportunities to do things in a variety of places, because he's real open and inquisitive, will only lead the discovery to a better outcome of job finding. I always like to show this graphic to talk about the difference between discovery and conventional assessment. And, once again, I mean, I came from the rehab world. I was the director at a rehab organization and a director of the rehabilitation part of that organization. And, our conventional assessments were always, kind of funnel-like in that we took a bunch of standard information, and you look at this graphic, these red dots stand for all the usual stuff that we asked in standardized testing and trials and those types of things. And as the assessment continued, it narrowed it down and was supposed to shoot out 3 vocational goals at the bottom. So the target of the assessment was to do all this stuff and then identify 3 vocational goals. And those 3 vocational goals typically related to something that you could find in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, or I think it has a different title to that book right now, but and then pursue that. And then the job developer would take those things and go out and they'd talk to businesses in the community, and they'd apply for open positions, and they'd do all the stuff that they would do, and they'd get rejected, and they'd come back and they'd basically start over again. Well, what discovery or discovering personal genius does is it flips it. And because we're starting with who the job seeker is, that's who we really want to know. I mean, who are you? What do you know how to do? What is of particular interest to you? Can you learn that? All of those things create this profile of who this person is. And what happens then is that you start to see greater possibility, because we believe that there are unlimited ways in the world that people make a living. And let me tell you about some of the ways we have found that people make a living. One of the young men that was supported by an organization that, back in the Twin Cities, was hired by a company that made swords and replica weapons, and no one even knew about it. Another young woman was hired by a person who ran a sole proprietorship, single-person business, providing live mannequins to stores and events and those kinds of things. Who would even know that these places are there? And so what we find is that the discovery approach, as it moves beyond who that person is and to where this person is going to be able to fit pretty well, we find all kinds of things. We find amazing things. Kerry Griffin in Montana, sent us a picture a couple of weeks ago of a guy who has a business where he has like these beetles, and what the beetles do is clean bones. People, just a lot of different ways people make a living. And the problem for most of us is we only know what we know, and we only know the things that we are familiar with. And so I wouldn't know before I met some of these people that there are more blacksmiths in the Twin Cities in Minnesota than there are anywhere in the world. There's no reason for me to know that. But now, starting to do this form of customized employment, we're learning all kinds of things like that. And it only goes to show you that people can do a lot of different things, and that the people that we work with, regardless of who they are and the type of disability they have, there's going to be a place for them somewhere if we look hard enough. This is a graphic that we use to talk about finding vocational themes, and vocational themes are imprecise. They're big, and a lot of things fit into them. But what we find is that these 6 elements are really kind of the foundation of the themes. Obviously you want to know about the person and what his or her personal attributes are. We also are concerned about what that person's interested in. However, interests, we know, aren't enough. We're all probably very interested in things that if you had to do it for a living, you'd be destitute. But interests guide us to other people, and that's kind of key, because if I'm interested in ancient swords and you're interested in ancient swords, we're probably going to have a conversation about ancient swords, and sooner or later one of us is going to ask the other, what do you do? So we start the relationship and the conversation that way. Tasks performed is another piece. So oftentimes we look at what people do at home and what they know how to do. If they have chores, they learn how to do a task, then they can learn how to do something else. And that's kind of a fundamental element of instructional philosophy, I guess. You can learn how to do one thing, you can learn how to do something else, and then it becomes my job as an instructor to teach you. Skills are important, and what we, again, believe is that no skill is insignificant. And you'd be surprised as we meet people how easy it is to pass over a skill that someone has, because we might believe it's sort of like, well, I don't know, it's just making toast, or it's just vacuuming the floor, or something that's just, we don't think is necessarily going to translate into a job, so we blow over it. But yet the key about skills is, once again, that the person learned it. And if somebody has a skill, we can find out how they learned it, who taught them, what the best way is to teach this person, to give them information. Learning and teaching in the world of employment, whether it's customized employment or any other kind of employment, is a critical element, and unfortunately too often overlooked or unattended. And yet, and when it's overlooked and unattended, then you start to hear things about people, about behaviors and all this kind of stuff, and yet we don't know how the person learns how to do things. We put all the onus on the person instead of on the support system. Conditions in work culture, this can't be unusual for anybody to know, right? Everybody participating here has experienced work in their lives where the situation, the people around them, or the work you were doing, or the hours, or the environment, or the travel, or the whatever, fit who you were, and you performed better. And when they didn't fit who you were, you didn't have such a great time of it. And so we really look at some of those things. What's important about conditions and about this whole thing is how I, as an employment specialist or employment consultant working with an individual, have to take my personal biases out. Okay, and I'll give you an example. The guy that got the job at working with the swords is a person who doesn't particularly like to take a bath, doesn't particularly like to shave or get a haircut, doesn't particularly like to change his clothes much, all of those sorts of things. This lived, I don't know if he still does, but he lived in a group home and was on a hygiene program for several years, and checklist 1 on the hygiene program was take a shower every morning. When the folks who were working with him did discovery, had a chance to talk with his grandfather, what they found was that this young man had some sort of traumatic experience with water as a very little kid and was terrified of water. So instead of finding that out, what happened was the system inferred some intent on this guy's part, that he wasn't doing it for some, you know, bizarre reason other than the fact that he's afraid of it. Nevertheless, that doesn't, you know, what I want to point out about this, I grew up in Northwest Indiana in steel mill country. Nobody's dad that I knew who worked in the steel mills ever took a shower before they went to work. So somebody who's not particularly crazy about showering or taking or shaving, or there are places out there where that's not important. And if we make this fellow have to do this in order to earn his way into employment, he may never get there. So my personal bias might be that I take a shower every morning and I think it's important, but I know places where it's not important. So I have to take my bias out of that and just take it from the person's standpoint and recognize that there are places all over the country, all over the world where that's not important. And then we do these things which we like to call EPD activities, and they're just things to do that help you to understand who this person is. Like, for instance, a young guy, you know, I keep saying young guys because everybody's younger than me now, but this man up in Duluth, Minnesota, and as the employment specialist who's working with him is trying to get to know who he is. He has an opportunity to meet this fellow at his place, finds out that he has a compound bow and a target, and you know, what we talked about was, well, a great discovery activity that you can do with him is ask him if he knows how to restring that bow, or if he can show you how to shoot it, or he can, you know, do whatever about it. It's not that he's going to have a job in the archery business. It's just that we're learning about him by doing different things and what he seems to gravitate toward. So the notion of I think, of discovery is that it's a little bit longer process to try to gather information and then start to see the relationships and trends that are going to emerge, and they will emerge, and they will emerge into what we call themes. So, for instance, somebody who is very interested in cars, you know, we can take that into automotives, we can take that into transportation, because there's just a way more there. I met a woman in Wisconsin a couple of years ago, and in talking with her, she talked about how she was very fastidious about cleaning her. She lived with her mom, cleaning her at the house, and that she'd had a job or at a hotel, and all of these things, and everybody kept focusing on the act of cleaning. And when we blew it up a little bit and said, well, what if the theme was cleanliness? Where could you go with that? And when it went to cleanliness, we found that, well, there were a lot of places that value cleanliness more so than the usual, you know, restaurant or laboratory or hospital. Some people say hotels, but they haven't stayed in hotels where I have, so I don't know that all hotels value cleanliness the same way. But nevertheless, so cleanliness is much bigger. Or we had a fellow in one of the organizations back in Minnesota who was really kind of focused on kind of morbid things and dark things, and when we delved into it with them, we settled on a theme of death. Now, you know, for most people, you would say we're going to settle on a theme of death. In our industry, we say, oh, wait, you can't do that. That's just too scary. That's just too weird. but yet taking our bias out of it and saying, what are 20 or 30 things that are related to death, other than killing somebody, right? We don't want to do that. But you know, it came into things like taxidermy, music, you know, at funerals, movies, all kinds of things. So again, themes with no attitude about bias can be really huge and open up a lot of possibilities. You're going to narrow them down, but you start out big and you narrow them down. And even in the smallest communities, these things happen. I mean, even in a small town, there's probably somebody who's involved with something about taxidermy or preparation of flowers or whatever. So you just have to believe they're out there, and the trick, I guess, is how do you find them? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Why do we say 3? Well, one's not enough, because if you have one and you're wrong, you're back to square one. You have to start over again. If you have 2 and you miss out on one, you're back to 1. And so 3 just seems to be the right number. And it's not scientific, it just seems to be the right number. The other thing that 3 does is it does allow you to mix and match. So somebody who, for some reason, is very interested in death or things related to death, and who has a very strong automotive theme, we might be able to get that person involved in or to interview or meet with a funeral director, because funeral directors obviously are involved with death, and they have really good cars. You know, so once again, you know, I might think that death is creepy, and but that's not about me. So I have to be able to take the individual where he or she is going to take me. Themes aren't the sum total of all those things, but all those things make themes stronger. And I know there are going to be questions about themes, and we could probably do a whole seminar, webinar on themes and talking about that. But I think the best way to think about themes is to look inward, look at yourself, and think back to your early, you know, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, and see if there are things that are the trends in your life that always seem to be there, and or situations that you always seem to wind up in. I know we always, every year, we have a rendezvous up in Idaho, Griffin Hamilton and some of our colleagues, and we were talking about themes. And you know, I've known Kerry Griffin since 1991, and we were just having this conversation about themes, and he just looked at me and he said, "Performance, that's one of your themes." And when I thought about it, I went, "Wow, yeah, it really is." And when I think about that, about performance and how performance has been part of my life, performing, you know, since I was very young, it's happened in a lot of different ways, and that might be a way to think about themes. When you look backward on your own lives and your careers. When you're dealing with like this young fella who's 19, who's here in Wyoming, it's going to be a little harder to find themes for him. He doesn't have a lot of life experience, a lot of world experience, so he has to do a little bit more in the avenue of activities and tasks and skills and those kinds of things to see where he gravitates toward. And then we start there knowing that he's probably going to change his mind. And that's a question I think is fair to ask for people. How many times do you get to change your mind about what you want to do for a living in your lifetime? How many times, what's the average number? I don't think anybody can give you that. But okay, so we're going to move on to the next. So themes and conditions of employment and who that person is are going to point you towards finding places in the community where those things exist or are of value. And so job development or cultivating employment opportunities, there are really a couple of different pieces to it, and these are the 4 that I settled on. What we find is an effective method is to take the themes and the conditions of employment and then ask the question, where are 20 places in the community where that happens or where that exists? And as I mentioned, we did that with death, and we found a whole bunch of places. Another theme that we explored was politics, and after you take out being a politician or running for office, just kind of put that aside, what else is there? People come up with all kinds of great ideas about what are things that are related to politics that are a little less obvious, because the obvious stuff is obvious. And it's one of the reasons why people have sort of been trapped in what have been typically known as the 5 F's of supported employment: food, filth, flowers, filing, and fetching. And there's nothing wrong with jobs in any of those areas. It's just that when you look at somebody and automatically push them into one of those things because of their disability, you really limit possibilities. And this happens a lot. I mean, like, I know in my career there's been the whole notion of people with developmental disabilities are really good at recycling, you know, they're really good at cleaning, really good at all those kinds of things. Or I've met people on the autism spectrum where folks would say, oh, this person has Asperger's, therefore they should be in IT. The reality is this, and this, I have some friends who, you know, taught me some things about working with folks who are on the autism spectrum, and what they have said is, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And I think you could say that about anybody. If you know one person with an intellectual disability, you know one person with an intellectual disability. The belief that everybody is different and everybody is unique is critical in this process. And even though people may share some characteristics, or they may share some traits, or they may share some common kind of attributes, that doesn't mean they're the same person. And so we have to look at people as individuals and help them find the places where they're going to fit the best. And it's probably not going to be a perfect match. I mean, one of the things that I've been saying for a long time is that one of the worst things we can ask a person is, what is their dream job? And not that people don't have such things, but you know, if you don't have a lot of experience in the world, how do you know what that is? How would you even answer that question? So I think our job early on, from school age earlier to, you know, as people move into the adult world, is to provide as many experiences for people so they have some context with which to pick. So the list of 20 is one of those ways where you find amazing things in your community and amazing ways that people earn a living and the kinds of things that happen. And there was a recent PBS story on NewsHour about the growing artisan economy, and was talking about how we're starting to see a resurgence of the artisan economy. And so what does the artisan economy tell you? It tells you that the labor market stuff really isn't going to help you, because the artisans do what they do, and they're in every community, and they're all over the place, and they're happy to tell you what they do, and they're happy to pass it on. So the list of 20 oftentimes are going to take you to those artisan places. In fact, we eschew, I'm sorry to use that word, I just like that word, but we stay away from places that have HR departments. And we try to stay away from the comparative types of hiring processes, because many of the people that we work with aren't going to succeed in that process. Now, there are going to be people who have, you know, particular disabilities who can succeed in those processes, and if they can, do that. But customized employment was really designed for people who that didn't work for. As Speed said in his introduction, people who typically folks said, yeah, we can't serve them, or we don't think they can work. That's who customized employment was really targeted to support. Yet it'll support anybody. So the list of 20, again, where are these 20 places? And then you just start talking to people. And we schedule informational interviews or informational meetings. And we really want to talk with the manager, or we want to talk with a key person or a key employee, and we want to get advice. And so this young man here in Wyoming, we're going to try to set him up with, there's another fellow in Wyoming who is really interested in a lot of video things and cataloging, and one of the guys here in town knows a guy that runs a company that does that. And so we're just going to go, and he's going to have an interview with the man that owns this company and just say, what advice can you give this fella who's really interested in this about your career and how you got through it. It's a much less intimidating process for people, both for those folks who would call themselves job developers and job seekers, and it's also much less intimidating for business folks. You go talk to the HR person at Medtronic, as an example, they can tell you about what Medtronic does, and they can tell you about the company culture, all that kind of stuff, but they can't tell you about how you make one of those things that they make. You need to talk to a maker, the person who does that. They can tell you how you do that. And so it's really tough in a larger corporation like that to get to that person who's actually making the thing, whereas in an artisanal business or a smaller business, you're probably going to find that person right away. So we try to do those. And the key to making this work is doing it a lot. And the more you do it, the more you find out about people and you find out about things. One place leads to another, and one thing leads to another, and one person leads to another. And then that last little quadrant up there talks about wage or self-employment. And I want to point out self-employment because self-employment is a viable option for folks. The thing you have to be cautious about is starting out with the presumption of self-employment. You know, we've had a lot of people that I've run into that said, well, this individual hasn't succeeded in the conventional way, so therefore we're going to self-employment, which I think is a backwards approach. I think the backwards approach, what I'm saying is that what we should be doing is, if you follow discovery, you follow this process, self-employment will pop up, will emerge as a potential avenue for folks. You can't make somebody have a business if it doesn't make sense. It won't succeed. So again, we're rethinking traditional or conventional methods. Discovery is a community-based functional assessment. It provides overarching vocational themes that allows for a broad collection of possible jobs. Many of those, most of them, are unknown or unseen to the public. And we know that people connect over shared interests, and employers connect to potential employees in that way. The smaller businesses, of which really represents the vast majority of businesses in our country, typically don't advertise their open positions. I actually heard somewhere, and I can't remember where I read it, that only about 10% of any available jobs are actually posted publicly. And so what typically happens in smaller businesses, and I can attest to this personally, being the son of a small business owner, is that they got employees through personal connections. And right now I've been reading a book called The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, and I really recommend it. It's a really great book. But he has a point there where he talks about a study that was done where 56% of the people who were interviewed said they had gotten their jobs from a personal connection. And so we still focus on that 56%. And what he learned in that, focusing on the 56%, that only 16% of those personal connections would be considered friends, and that the other 84% were acquaintances. And his point was that if you rely on your friends, they're going to know the same things you know. They're your friends because they operate in the same circles that you operate in. And he said, whereas your acquaintances are into all kinds of things, and a lot of different things. And so he said something that I thought was pretty amazing in the book, that people who can find those acquaintances, who can connect to those people, gain access to places where they don't belong. And I think that's pretty cool, because we think about getting to places where not that I don't belong, that they don't want me there, but I don't belong there because it's not in my ordinary everyday existence of what I do and where I go. We also try to circumvent the HR department. And trust me, I have nothing against HR people. I know some, they're very nice people, but they have a different kind of job. We want to connect directly with somebody. And it's possible to do customized employment with people in organizations that have HR departments and all. I'm just saying it's a little bit harder track, but you can do it. And there are people who are pretty good at that. So I'm not saying throw that out. I'm just saying I don't have time for that now. I have time I want to devote my time to this other thing, to working with individuals one-on-one and their personal unique talents. We know that employers are always hiring. They always hire people who have similar input values, and especially they hire people who can generate profits. So we've all worked in places that said they weren't hiring, and then before you knew it, somebody got hired. It just happens. And so this process tries to connect you to people. It's a people process as opposed to a business process. But business becomes a key element because folks are really going to, they're not going to hire you just because you're a nice person. They're not going to hire you just because they want to feel good. Feel good ends fast if profits go south. And so we also want to remember that people hire to improve their business. And if you can present somebody, connect somebody with a job seeker or an individual who's going to add value to that business person's going to, what business person wouldn't think about it? So that's the piece that we're trying to do, is to demonstrate and build a competence skill of the people that we work with. Some of that skill and competence can be built through training programs. Some of it can be built through certificate programs. Many of them, however, the people that I work with, that's just not going to work. We're going to have to get down and teach people how to do things. Sales training is an important tool in the job developer's arsenal. However, it's not about sales. It's just about some of the things you need to understand about sales, about empathy, about negotiation, and those sorts of things. People who do this are going to need to know how to manage their time and understand their services and represent job seekers in a respectful manner. And that's the next step. And the next step is about, and we'll talk about it in the world of sales, is, we have to approach it a little bit differently. And we know that quality employment is built on the match between a personal contribution and the work and the needs of the workplace. We know that. If we overemphasize selling, we miss the point of community employment. It is not, as sales approaches sometimes suggest, a charitable thing to do. We've had that happen. And it lasts for a little while, but it can't be based on charity. It really has to be based on hard profit, on that we're going to help people improve their business. And so here's how I like to describe that in the conventional world of sales and job development, of which I was part of, we really had to do these four things. So the first thing that I always say is you have to sell yourself, right? You have to make the person you're talking to like you. So you're selling yourself. Then you have to sell your agency or your company. So I'd be saying, I'm Bob, I'm with such and such an agency. And unfortunately, so often the human service agencies that we work for have a human service name. And so because of that, or because we have some reference to disability in our name or in even the material that we may have, now we're selling disability. Now we're having to talk about the disability. And we have to do all three of those things before we finally get to the job seeker. We're saying in this process, there are only two rules to sales. Rule one, the focus must always be on the individual job seeker. Rule number two, never break rule number one. And if you keep that in mind, then it absolutely focuses you on that person, and it will take you to the places. And there's a huge element of just belief that you can do this. That people who believe they can get it done, just the way it is. We love the graphic of the iceberg because what conventional methods, what we've been doing, has been shooting at the tip of the iceberg. But yet, if you look below the surface, you see the mass of the iceberg is below the surface, outside of our view. And so customized employment uses these things: a positive vocational profile. And by positive, I don't mean that we're glossing over things that a person does or attributes or where they are that aren't necessarily great. But I wouldn't lead off by telling you what my faults are. I'm certainly going to lead off by telling you about what my skills are, my positive approaches. We use themes instead of job descriptions. Job descriptions are narrow and specific. And And, you know, I can tell you, in my dad's business, I don't know if he ever knew what a job description was, but he knew how to fix cars, and he knew people who could fix cars, and he wanted people who could help him do that, but he didn't have any job descriptions. We talked customized employment. It's important to understand the ideal conditions of employment. What are the conditions of employment, and what are the things present? And this isn't unique to the work that we do. I mean, in Richard Bowles' books, What Color is Your Parachute? He's essentially going through a whole series of checklists and exercises to help you identify your conditions of employment. You might call them something different. And then we use informational interviews to connect job seekers with potential employment opportunities. We develop up and down the supply chain. So, for instance, with another fellow here in Wyoming knows an awful lot about rodeo things, and so they're going to set up a meeting with a guy who's a saddle maker here in Wyoming, and like everybody says, this is the guy you need to talk to about having saddles made for you. And so what's the supply chain look like? Well, the supply chain for that guy goes out two ways. One way is the customer base. Who buys his saddles? Where does he sell them? How does he sell them? And then up the supply chain, the other way, where does he get his leather? If he uses silver, you know, ornamentation or other kinds of ornamentation, does he make that or does he get that? And who gets? So you can move in both directions, and that's what the supply chain means. Instead of specifically saddle making, what else is connected to it? We do focus on small and medium-sized businesses just because we find that we are getting more traction there than we are with the large corporate entities. And we look for artisanal businesses where people actually do something. And part of that is that there's doing and knowing. And for most of us, when we entered the workforce, we entered because of doing, not because of what we knew. And we gained knowledge, and we learned how to do things. And then as you move through the workforce, you might then be moving into jobs where people hire you because of what you know. But they're two different things. But because the people that we're primarily working with don't succeed in the comparative methods of resumes and all that kind of stuff, it's really, we're going to focus on doing and finding doing. And then the notion of social capital. And social capital really is about the reciprocal relationships that people have in communities and the values of reciprocity and knowing people. And there again, so many of the people that we work with don't have a lot of social capital, so employment helps them to build that. They become known. They become expected to be places. And the other thing just to point out is that there are people out there who are interested in the same things that interest you. And I'll just tell you a story about a guy came out of high school and referred to this employment organization. And as they started doing discovery with him and talking to him, they found out that this guy loves squirrels. I mean, all he talks about are squirrels. And he'll tell you about the different kinds of squirrels and what they eat and what they do and all kinds of squirrel stuff. And that's all he loves to talk about. And of course, his interdisciplinary team folks around him say, you got to quit talking about squirrels. That's just too weird. That's just, nobody does that, right? And you know, and they would say this word, they would say he was obsessed with squirrels, which I find really interesting that we use that word so casually, obsessed, you know. I love things, but he's obsessed, you know, that kind of stuff. So anyway, so I'm driving down the street in St. Paul, where I live, and I was in a kind of a bumper-to-bumper rush hour thing. And one of the things that I would really encourage people to do, those of you who work with folks, you know, doing job development, to do employment discovery and all that, is always keep your camera ready. And now it's easier to do because everybody's got a phone that has a camera on it, and just take pictures of things. You just never know. So I'm driving down the road. I'm creeping along. I look over to the side of the street, and I see this. Now, I don't know if you can see that really well, but it's a vanity license plate that says Squirrel Guy. And below the license plate, it says, I break for squirrels. and there are stickers on the back of this guy's car of different organizations that are devoted to squirrels. Since I've seen this, and I have shown it at a couple of different trainings and workshops in Minnesota, I have met 3 people that know this guy. And they say, yeah, he just loves squirrels. He doesn't have a job in the world of squirrels. He has a different job, a straight job. But in his spare time, he's all about squirrels and squirrel habitat. Now, so what does that tell us? That says if we can get this young guy who just got out of high school, who just loves squirrels, and connect him with Squirrel Guy, they're going to talk about squirrels. And Squirrel Guy may, if it's possible, take an interest in this fellow, this young man, and then things change. And that's really this people-to-people thing that I'm talking about. I know that we have been trying to engage businesses, and we keep saying we have to educate businesses. And we keep talking about businesses, but yet businesses have always hired people with disabilities. So I think, and again, this is me, and people can be mad at me about it if they like, I don't think this is about business at all. I think this is about people. And I think that you're going to be successful if you connect people with people. And if the people that you connect the person with happen to run a business, that's terrific. And your odds of getting a job are much better. But I've been an employer. I was responsible for 50 people and hiring and all those sorts of things. And I can tell you, hiring is a personal decision. And it's always been a personal decision at some level. And so if you know that, and we understand that, then the person-to-person thing becomes the way that we're going to make this happen, as opposed to initiative, projects, programs, and all the things that we've been doing for decades that produce minor dents in the employment rates of people with disabilities. I'm not saying they're useless. I'm just saying this seems to work better. Conditions of employment, and again, I'm going to kind of blow through this a little bit, so we'll have some time for questions. But there are considerations for a good worksite fit, and there are cultural considerations. They don't necessarily change the theme, but they help discern which places are the best. Work hours, use of particular skills, or performance of particular tasks, pay, intensity of supervision. Those kinds of things are part of the conditions of employment. Dress, humor, muscles or brains. These are unusual things, and as I said, these are things that have been under consideration and thought of for decades. And if you look at your own personal experiences, and I think this is one of the beauties of customized employment, is we've all probably at some level have had a customized job, and where your manager, your supervisor, your employer has put you in the position to really take advantage of your strengths and minimize your weaknesses. And we all, as a manager myself, did this all the time. Do more of what you're good at, do less of what you're not good at. We'll get somebody who's good at what you're not good at to do that. And that really is kind of a key element of good management, and that nobody is really good at everything. So and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see the return of the specialists, people who are really good at a specific thing and can excel at that, as opposed to the generalists who are almost good at some things, or most things, but they don't excel at anything. And like I said, dress, humor. One of the things in my life as a ideal condition of employment is I'm not good with supervision. I mean, people supervising me, it's not a really good thing. So being in control or being having a lot more autonomy is a real important condition of employment for me. Movement, not a lot of sitting in a place and being sedentary doesn't work for me. And I'm not unusual in that regard. So there's a place out there for everybody. You just have to understand that is true. So what about the labor market? Well, the labor market statistics really don't tell the whole story. I've read stuff that's come out of the state demographer at the state of Minnesota and other places that talk about here are the trends, and those are the big overarching trends. But what we find is that an abundance of employment occurs in less obvious places and businesses. And so we're not trying to react to the labor market, we're trying to create a labor market. And the other thing that's really interesting is that growth and recession don't seem to change the employment rate for people with disabilities. It stays about the same, has stayed about the same at around 20% for a very long time in rough times and in good times. So you'd say, well, in the great times, the unemployment rate ought to go up. Well, it doesn't. And in the rough times, you'd say, well, it ought to go down. Well, it doesn't. It stays about the same, which again says that, to me, that our methods need to be altered. We need to try different things. So once again, there are a lot of ways to do it. I think that for many of us are still, the metaphor that I like to use in terms of how we do employment and job development for people with disabilities are still using rotary phones. They can make a phone call. They can get you a phone call, but can they do all of the things that your smartphone can do right now? And so we're saying we're improving the tools. And that's another thing. If you remember at the beginning when Speed did the introduction, he talked about customized employment as a set of tools. That is exactly what it is. It is a set of tools. It is a method for getting something done. Just like a rotary phone is a method for making a phone call. Same thing that can happen on a smartphone. So we're looking at finding different ways to do it. This is a graph that we found from the Kaufman Foundation on entrepreneurship, and it shows that in between 2010 and 2012, there were 34.5 million total companies in the U.S. at that time. 22 million of those were single-owner companies. The woman who has the mannequin company, she's a single owner. She's the only person that owns that company. So you see that the vast majority of American companies are owned by one person. And as you go down a little bit further, you see that 11 million companies in the U.S. have 1 to 19 employees. That's, that's a lot. All over. So there's some of those 11 million are in your city and in your state. But here's the thing that I always find most interesting about this graph is that of companies in the U.S. that have more than 500 employees, there are but 38,500. And that's who we chase all the time. Right? We're always chasing those guys, and they're bad companies. They're fine. They're good places to work for some people. But we keep chasing after those guys and inviting them and having them be on our councils, and yet we're missing 22 million or 11 million other ones. And so what I would say is the next step for those of you who who do this is find those guys and talk to them. Now, what I will tell you is when you talk with smaller companies, if you try to sell them something, they're going to kick you out the door. So what we found is that this conversational approach of informational interviewing and getting advice is more likely to result in a conversation that will lead to a next step as opposed to a sale where people see a sale, they shut down. We use informational interviews. In fact, we're trying not to call them interviews anymore because people get an idea that it's an interview, and what we're really talking about is a meeting with somebody. We're using it to develop work experience, to identify work settings, build a mental database. There are a lot of things, but it's a conversation. It helps us refine themes, you reveal skills and tasks. You go on a visit and you find all kinds of things that you didn't know were there. It happens all the time, and every time we have set up training and we send people on informational meetings, to practice it, they always come back with some amazing story of something that they learned that they didn't expect. You can reveal the presence of those conditions of employment. It helps warm up to job development. The actual ask. Sooner or later, you got to ask, and helps avoid thinking in job descriptions and create professional relationships. So these are some of the reasons that we have found the informational interview, the informational meeting method to be effective. Contact smaller businesses, dig deep for interesting businesses, email or drop in Phone calls seem to work really well. My preferred method is to drop in and try to set something up. I'm working with a guy here who's really interested in this kind of thing. We have like 10 minutes of your time, but it can be an email or a phone call, whatever you're most comfortable with. But you're only asking for about 15 or 20 minutes of the person's time and asking for advice. And what we usually find is that 15, 20 minutes isn't nearly enough, but you ask for it and people give you more. Ask for advice. You can take notes, get as many leads as possible, names, email, addresses, determine what's your next step. And you could change the list of 20. And that's one of the things that we find is that the list of 20 oftentimes blows up to the list of 60 really quickly. So that you start down the list and talk with the person, and they say, you ought to talk to so-and-so. Now you've just taken a right turn and you started down a whole nother path. You've got to be flexible enough to do that. And that's another element of this, of being successful in this, is the element of flexibility. Being able to change directions when you need to and not get so enamored with one single pathway. Things happen, right? You get rejected sometimes. Some people say that's it or they don't want to talk to you, then go on to the next thing. And once you believe that there are other places, that's not as devastating as it used to be. Language is important. Focus on strengths and abilities. We talk about job seekers or individuals, or in this case, we've got a student who's leaving school, as opposed to client, consumer, participant, low or high functioning. Any of those things are just killers. And even avoiding referring to yourself as a job coach or job developer or some human service jargon. You'd be surprised how many people have a perception and an attitude about what a job coach or job developer is in the community based on any number of things. Career counselor is something that we talk, use pretty regularly. Employment consultant, whatever, but try to tone down the human service jargon. The business person is the expert. So even if I know something about, for instance, I'm a musician. I play a lot of different instruments. For me to go with a job seeker to a music place is probably not a good idea because I can't help myself in not talking about music. So, but if I was a really good actor, I could pretend like I didn't know anything and let the business person be the expert. Talk about the shared interests that that business person has with the individual so they can connect. Don't talk about us. Don't talk about your business, yourself, or your personal experiences. And practice what we call smooth listening, which is a form of active listening. We use this exercise, and I talked a little bit earlier about it, to tease out some themes when we're doing training, and we'll throw these out. And so you feel free to use these. I mean, these are actual themes that people came up with for individual job seekers, and so we pulled them out. So these were pretty interesting. Let's see what happens. And so music, death, politics, kind of an interesting juxtaposition, huh? Construction and transportation. To just say, what are 20 things? Don't talk about places. What are 20 things related to music? 20 things related to death? 20 things related to politics? And what we have found is that people don't stop at 20 in this exercise. It's like 3 or 4 individuals working in a team that come up with these ideas. They come up with like 30 or 40, and it's pretty amazing. And so now you say, if you could find a place in your community where that happens, and it really takes the it releases a lot of pressure. It's pretty interesting thing. So on the way back, you want to review this. What led you to that place? You always want to know why did you go there, and then how did you contact the business? What went well? And you start to build your approach. This is how we do it. This is how we go about doing it. And the fellow that I'm working with here in Cheyenne is learning this process now. And what's amazing to watch is how he is learning how to think in this way. That as he's had the opportunity to work with us, and I've been trained to do this. I mean, it doesn't come naturally to me. I had to learn how to do it, but I'm able to share it. And now he's seeing how I process the information that I get, how different it is from what he's been doing, and able to adopt some of the different things. And so critical reviews are very important. And I have to tell you that I had a conversation with some people that I thought were pretty good at this, and I asked them, after an informational interview, you walked away from that and you said, that was a really good one. What made it so? And they said there were three things. And they said the things that made it so were, one, that the individual that they were working with and the business person made a personal connection, that they connected. Secondly was that they got a referral. They had names of other people to talk with. And the third thing, which I thought was really significant, was they said they felt embarrassed to be there. And so what does that mean? It means that humility is a key element of this. And that's sort of, you know, the opposite of the sales approach, right? In the sales approach, humility isn't one of those things that we look for. But yet humility is critical here, because humility means I'm able to, for it not to be about me. I'm able to let it happen. I'm able to back away. I'm able to be an observer as opposed to being a participant in this. And that's a little bit different. So, okay, I'm gonna go through this again. Employment supports, most typical stuff, you know, are a thorough job analysis, instructional plan, clothing, specialized equipment, transportation, those types of things. What we find is that one of the former assistant commissioners, assistant secretaries of ODEP, Neil Romano, said this one time in a meeting that he said, business is a self-correcting entity. It'll figure out how to get things done. And so oftentimes transportation can be something that can be solved. But once again, if you do discovery well, you're going to know what the transportation issues are. So you'll have already thought those through. So discovery helps to identify supports before employment begins. Final phase, ongoing support, career development. And again, these three elements: continued consultation and connection with the job seeker and with the business. Career advancement or development opportunities, always pushing for the next thing or the better thing or more or, you know, different, or as things change, readapting to change sorts of things. And then continuing to update and enrich a personal profile. Those are the things that happen. I have to tell you that we're going to have someone to talk to you about their customized employment experience as a business owner, but they were unable to work with us today. Something came up. But I will tell you the story of Scott. And Scott's a young man who, you know, it's like a lot of guys coming out of high school, didn't really quite know what he wanted to do, but had a bunch of different ideas about what he wanted to do. And I think he wanted to be a personal trainer or something. But anyway, in the long run, he got a job at a coffee shop, a cafe close to where he lives, and just doing regular kind of work in the coffee shop. You know, he was doing dishes and doing things like this. But what happened was that, you know, he's a great guy and people really enjoyed him and him being around. But at this coffee shop, what they learned was that the owner was contracting with another company in the Twin Cities for their ice cream. And this company that they were contracting with, if you talk to people in St. Paul and you say, what's the best place to get ice cream in St. Paul, they're probably going to tell you the name of this place. There's going to be one of these two places they're going to tell you to go to for the best ice cream. Well, Gigi's Cafe was using one of those places. And so if you were just to go to this place and get ice cream on your own, it's pretty expensive. So you can imagine when you add in transportation costs and storage and all that, moving from one place to another, it really escalates the price. So started this discussion about with Scott, because he talked about ice cream, that perhaps they could make ice cream on their own and at the cafe and cut out the middleman and just go directly with that. Well, because Scott had access to some loans and his task plan and some supports and business supports from the cafe and from the organization that was supporting him, he was able to purchase an ice cream making machine, an industrial grade ice cream making machine, and host it at the cafe, Gigi's Cafe, to make various flavors of ice cream that they will sell at their coffee shop. And so it took a while to create the business plan and to get all the funding in place. But if you go to the website, if you look up Gigi's Cafe in Minneapolis, you'll see she lists on there that highlights the fact that they're now selling ice cream, and then there's a link to Scott's particular story that talks a little bit about it. Well, here's the thing that's important about it. One was that Scott started out as a wage employee. So he didn't go in there with the idea he was going to start a business. He went in there to get a job and had a job. But then, along with the employment consultants that were supporting him and his own ideas and of course the support of the owner and of the chef who really helps him with recipes, they came up with this plan and executed it. And I think the cost of the machine was about $16,000, hosted at Gigi's, and but Scott's business plan has been paying it off in 3 years, which is pretty amazing. A couple of things: he was the new mayor of Minneapolis had her inaugural party, and Scott's ice cream was featured there. So he's really grown the business, has his own logo, his own brand, and again, it's a symbiotic relationship with it's a business within a business. Scott's still, last I remember, Scott was still an employee, worked some hours as an employee, but then when he's making the ice cream, he's his own employee, his own owner of his own business. But again, the idea of the customization of this was, as Scott got into the business as a regular employee, the people supporting him didn't stop thinking about what the next thing was or what could happen there. And it was through those conversations and those what-ifs that they were able to create this business plan. And I'm really happy to say that Griffin Hammes, we were pretty involved with helping Scott and the people with him to create a business plan and help him get the funding and all those sorts of things. So I really wish, story coming from me isn't nearly as good as the story would have come from them, but life gets in the way, and so I apologize for them not being able to participate. But with that, I needed to talk a little bit about and just make reference to again, career pathways, which is it's a little different approach, but because it talks to, but things that are critical here that I think are really important is building cross-agency partnerships. Being able to braid and blend funding becomes really important. There are going to be industry sector and industry employers that you're going to be able to engage. So I'm not saying this the way we did it is the only way. There are other ways to do it as well. And I think that we're seeing a lot of focus being on different trades and skills that are going to be beneficial for folks. Education and training programs are important, and I believe that the key element in education and training is experience, getting people a lot of different experiences and starting early. Identifying funding needs and sources, we're doing that right here in Wyoming right now. And this is what is one of the harder parts, is how do you align policies and programs, and that's not just on the government level, but even within organizations. How do you make it work? And then measurement. Measurement's critical. If we don't measure, we won't know where we are. So, and once again, these things are all important. Identifying skills and qualifications, targeting goals, and targeting goals, and engaging, getting the business community involved. And then shifting our career expectations to be flexible, I think, is a really key piece. So there you go. So I will leave this open now for questions, and hopefully we can get to them.
Thank you so much, Bob. This was just really, really wonderful and such an abundance of information and a lot to think about. I do want to offer to Speed Davis if he wants to make any more comments about career pathways or customized employment, and then we do have a brief amount of time for questions. I want to assure everyone, if you have a question and we're not able to get to it today, please still write it in the chat box. We'll make sure to post all of the questions and answers on the Lead Center website along with the recording of the webinar. So, Speed, did you have any comments that you wanted to add?
I think just in the interest of time, I'll just thank Bob for his fine presentation and turn it over to questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Speed, and again, thank you so much, Bob. We did have a couple of questions come in, and I know that a lot of the focus of what you described today in customized employment was geared towards the smaller companies, but I did get a question from someone who works for a larger company and has the HR folks tell them, merely apply online at a job fair or something like that. And is there a way to get senior leadership to be more involved so that the customized employment at larger companies can be facilitated a bit more easily? I don't know if there's any experiences you've had with that.
Yeah, well, I think that what we have seen, and I think it bears out with some of the examples nationally, is that the thing that seems to be common in larger companies and corporations is a personal connection to disability. And I'll give you an example. I just had a phone call last week from Travelers Insurance about Disability Awareness Month in October, and wanting to talk about employment. And what the guy told me was he happens to have a son who with autism, and so he said, this is very personal to me. And I think that's, so I don't know that you can convince somebody for it to be a good idea, but I think if you find the people where there is some sort of personal connection, and once again, how do you do that? You probably need to do it by talking to other people. But I don't think you can force a positive attitude. I don't think you can force that to happen. You have to get to the person. And unfortunately, for a lot of people who are in the world of job development, getting to that person is probably very rare because they don't operate in the same social circles that they do as well. But yeah, I think and I think the other thing that if you just keep in mind that if you can't get into that corporation, go somewhere else. I mean, it's just, to me, I would rather, succeed than have something I have to get in there. So I wish I had a magic, potion for it, but I don't.
Great, thanks, Bob. I know we have a few more questions that are coming in. In the interest of everyone's time, why don't we answer one more question, and then we'll have some closing remarks. And then again, as promised, we will make sure that everyone's questions are answered and posted online with the recording. So the final question is, are you aware of any good IDD waiver programs that support customized employment? And do you have an example from some good model states?
I wasn't laughing, I was coughing. Well, I can talk about Minnesota because as I work there, and what's happening in Minnesota that I think is promising is that Minnesota has a money follows the person grant, and through the Medicaid waiver, and what they've decided to do in the money follows the person, which is a whole life approach, targeting people who have been in an institution for 90 days or more. But what they have done is said that in the employment world, so if the person is a money follows person and wants to pursue employment, it's going to be customized employment. And so with that, we're right now in the process of training practitioners who can follow that process. And what the state has done is provided milestone payments, very similar to the milestones approach for Ticket to Work. But so what happens is if an employment provider who has gone through training and is now approved works with the money follows the person individual in employment, when they have completed the personal profile or the discovery staging record, they get an incentive payment. They're also getting paid, their incremental rates for supported employment, but then they finish that profile, they get an incentive payment. When that person goes into employment, first day when they go into employment and they can validate that, they get the provider gets another incentive payment, and then they will get a third one if that individual is still employed 90 days. It's probably still not enough money, but it's still better than what the the alternative is. And what's important for us in this, for me particularly, is that we get to really watch the process because it's controlled, as opposed to where a lot of times in the customized employment world, people are doing bits and pieces of customized employment, but it's not the whole process, and it's kind of destined not to work. So I think Minnesota, looking at the money follows the person is one thing. And yeah, I really couldn't tell you much about many of the other states right now.
Hi, this is Speed Davis. That's what's going to show up in our compendium. We're working on a number of states, many who are using Medicaid waivers to provide customized employment, following up on the CMS emphasis on employment these days. So if you watch our website for the customized employment page over the next 2 to 3 months, you'll see examples of states with the documentation that they used in order to implement their waivers.
Great. Thanks, Pete. And the Lead Center will make sure to share those through the Lead Center website as well when those come available. So thanks for sharing those, Pete, and thanks for the Minnesota example, Bob. So it's just after 4:30, so I do want to start wrapping things up here. First of all, thank you so much again to Bob. Was really just a great amount of information, and I'm sure I will be going back and looking at it myself. Just wanted to share a few next steps that you can take to support and implement customized employment in your area. So Lead Center Archives, we have another webinar from last year on customized employment. This one will be available, as I mentioned, and kind of a bit of an echo, Nakia. We can also explore DOL ODEP customized employment resources like Speed Shared. As Bob mentioned, shift your view of job placement from sales to securing informational interviews, and then connecting with your local AJC partners to learn more about their career pathways initiatives. So those are some great next steps. If you have questions, if you need any assistance, feel free to reach out to the Lead Center. Any of us here are happy to be a support for you. Again, thank you, Bob, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. We really appreciate the participation. It's just so overwhelming to see such a great number of people on the webinar. The Lead Center does offer a free webinar series. It's the last Wednesday of each month from 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And this was the first in a series of webinars that focuses on employment and improving employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. On the 27th, we're going to provide a webinar on best practices in employee retention and return to work. It's going to be lessons learned from employers. We'll have the U.S. Business Leadership Network and Families and Work Institute on the line. The Families and Work Institute just completed their 2014 National Study of Employers in partnership with USBLN. It's going to be really interesting. We hope that it will provide some great information for you on return to work best practices that you can utilize in your employment efforts. The other webinar that we have coming up is September 24th. I won't say too much about it, but we will get to it next month. We'll explain it a little bit more in depth. That one's going to be on the strategic partnerships between CILs and AJCs and how those partnerships can lead to better employment and economic advancement outcomes. Again, just in closing, I want to say thank you to Bob. I have contact information for Janet Stevely, a colleague of Bob Nemec's over at Griffin Hammis. She works with us on the Lead Center program. Also feel free to reach out to me. And if you have a question that we didn't get an answer to today, you can still put it in the chat box or email it to me, and we'll make sure to post it with our webinar archives. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope that you will join us again next month, And again, thank you to our speakers and to all of you for joining. Have a great day.